Today, everybody is looking at Iran, but Iran is only the spark. The real story is how one shock travels through fuel, shipping, money, and parts, and that it then lands on the battlefield. Because when tension rises in the Gulf, insurers raise the risk premiums. The shipping routes, they change, and that pushes up fuel and freight cost even before anything is destroyed. And those higher costs show up as inflation pressure. And inflation pressure shows up then as political pressure in Moscow. And while today Russia is continuing its long range strike campaigns within Ukraine, it still requires components, machine tools, and logistics brokers. But today it's become more complicated for Russia to get that, even more complicated for Russia to get what it needs to make drones. But all of this fits together to just tell one story how the situation for Russia is much more complicated than people realize. It's not just about what Putin promises, it's about what he can deliver. And today, things are getting further out of control for the Putin regime. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm Kyiv Post special correspondent and a Kyiv based national security advisor. So, when we look at the situation overall today for Russia, it's certainly not very good. And there's a few reasons for that. We see what's going on with their country economically, see what's happening with their military, we see what's happening demographically, we see what's happening politically as the tensions are getting worse. Right now, the leadership in Russia is at each other's throats. They realize that things are not going well, that the window of opportunity to make money is closing every single day. And it's not clear for how much longer Vladimir Putin will back them. He's already allowed some of the ones from the intelligence service to gobble up those that are from the billionaire class. And if he's doing that, at which point will it stop? At which point will he put his foot down? Or will he not put his foot down? So today, there's a lack of faith within the Russian population that things will get better. A lot of people are becoming very concerned that things are about to get worse. So subscribe now. Help us get 275,000 subscribers as we follow the situation in Russia and Iran and the rest of the world. Because once you understand that Russia is not a lone actor, this is not about a war with Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine for the Russians is ultimately just a battlefield, an important battlefield, but just a battlefield. Russia today believes that it is at war with the West, that is fighting the Fourth World War, a war against the West, along with its allies such as North Korea, such as Iran. But today, Iran can't really contribute much to that war. At the same time, we see the Venezuelans can't do much. The Cubans are on the brink, and today it is not clear what will happen next. But for Vladimir Putin, that all means that he has fewer options. Right now, within Russia, there are people seeking to overthrow the Putin regime. And though it's not often reported, it's true. There's groups such as ATESH. We've seen them regularly attacking the Russian railways. And what's so incredible about that is severalfold. First, the fact that there are people within Russia seeking to overthrow the Putin regime. But more than that is the fact that they are attacking the logistics of Russia, which is a strategically wise move. Now, of course, this helps Ukraine because when the Russians can't use trains, that means that tanks don't get to the battlefield. That means that the soldiers don't get to the battlefield. That means that artillery does not get to the battlefield. And all of these things only get worse when there's more attacks within Russia. But it's not just in Russia that we see this. It's quite infrequent that we see in the press how much happens in things like totalitarian regimes where there are groups seeking to overthrow them openly. Now, groups like the Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard, are charged with tracking them down to making sure they can operate. But still, they continue to do so. We've seen plenty of videos come out of them attacking the Russian railways. But can you imagine within Iran, there was also like groups? For instance, MEK, Mujahideen al-Qaeda. What's so interesting about them is that they are the Iranian opposition, one of them. They are trying to remove the Islamic Republic and make it a secular state, a democratic state. And in fact, they are not working with the other opposition groups like Reza Pahlavi, who's the son of the former Shah, but they have their own system. They have their own network. And within Iran, just last week, they sought to enter the residence of the Ayatollah with weapons. So they are a serious organization. They are seeking to work directly to create a democratic state and a state where there's equality. In fact, their leader is a woman they consider to be the democratically elected leader of Iran currently. But in either case, when we go back to Russia, we see something fascinating, a great parallel to what we see in Iran. That though the totalitarian system seems very strong, there's a lot happening below the surface that is rarely talked about, that the dictator is desperate to make sure that others don't learn about. But today it's harder to cover that up. Today it's harder to cover up the things that are happening within these countries. Consider another group within Russia, the National Republican Army. Now, it's called the NRA, and what's interesting about that is that the organization has carried out significant attacks on Russia. They've not only killed the propagandist, they tried to kill Alexander Dugin. Dugin is often called Putin's brain, and in fact, though, he never met Putin. But neither here nor there, he is often credited with ideology that is the basis for Vladimir Putin's Russian world. Now, so fascinating about him, though, specifically, is that he is very often on television talking about what's happening, and he's always said that Russia's greatest ally, the one that shares the most in common with ideologically, is Iran. So, why is it that they would share such an affinity for each other? What do they have in common? Well, from all outside perspectives, you would assume they have very little in common. One is Islamic fundamentalist. The other one is, in fact, just a kleptocracy. It's a mafia. And yet, they see something in common with each other. These illiberal democracies work together. When you think about what they have in common, it's never about ideology, really. What does North Korea really have in common with the Cuban leadership? And what does that have in common with the Russian leadership or the Iranian leadership? They have nothing in common. What they have in common is a need to work together to try to survive the sanctions that they're under, to try to create a black market in which they can all work. But that's why today the strikes that we see within Iran are such a game changer for what we will see next inside of Ukraine. Now, we clearly see that the tide of history is on the side of Ukraine. Ukraine is pushing forward. The Russians are losing territory. The Russians are right now lacking soldiers. They're lacking munitions. And now that we've seen the attacks within Iran, the destruction of the ability for Iran to be shipping more parts to the Russians, things will only get more complicated. But there's another part of this which is very important to also highlight. And that is that today, for the Russians, we see there's something important. They realize that time is not on their side. Because if these attacks continue, if all of a sudden we see that the Iranians truly are defeated, that will make it much harder for the Russians to get money because the Iranians are the experts in the money laundering. It's not often known, but a lot of the money laundering that occurs for all the black markets globally, whether it's the narcos or if it's those who are dealing with things such as human trafficking, they work with the Iranians. The Iranians are experts in this. But today, that door might be closed for them. And so for the Russians, getting more liquidity is going to be a challenge. Now, the Russian economy as a whole is already weak. We've discussed before how bad the debt situation is. The fact that the government blew through the total amount of money that they were allowed to have for debt by the end of the year just in the month of January. They don't have any more reserves left to burn up from their budget. They are already in the red. So as the situation gets worse for Russia, it's going to be very difficult to pay a premium for more parts, to pay a premium to get the things they need to continue waging war. And that's why today there's probably more and more rumors that Vladimir Putin is willing to make a peace deal. And it's not so much that he wants peace, but perhaps he realizes now his back is against the wall. Now, for Russia, as the situation gets worse, there's something else that we notice happening. We notice that the oligarchical class within Russia is becoming uncomfortable. They seem to realize that things are not going well. A telltale sign within a dictatorship that things are going very not well is how people start to exfiltrate from the country. The way that they typically do it is this. First, they send off their relatives. Then they send off their money. And finally, they're the last ones to leave. There's an entire operation of how they get out before things fall apart. And in Russia, we are seeing that. But there's something else that's also absolutely incredible that's happening simultaneously. We see that right now for the Putin regime, as it's trying to figure out what to do inside of Ukraine, it's realized that it cannot take Kyiv any longer. In fact, it was just announced last week by Kirill Budanov, who is the head of the presidential administration and the former head of the military intelligence, that the Russians have no intention of taking Kyiv any longer, which makes everything that we see on the battlefield today even more absurd. Russia today realizes it will not take Kyiv. So why does it burn through 1,200,000 soldiers needlessly, senselessly? It's because today they have no other option. If the war were to end tomorrow, the Russian economy will implode. It's overheating because it's all the growth that we see in the Russian economy is from military spending. In fact, military spending is about 7.9% of GDP. That's a huge amount, about $186 billion a year. But for Russia, if it doesn't have the cash, it cannot keep doing that. Then it has some serious problems that are even worse. But even more complicated than that is, what does it do if it no longer has a choice? If this war ends because it runs out of key parts, the Iranians, quite smartly, did not give the Russians everything they needed to do their own Gerin drones, which is the Russian version of the Shahed drones. The reason they didn't give them all the parts, I'm quite sure, is it was an insurance policy that would force the Russians to back the Iranians. But today, we see that the Russians are not doing very much to help their Iranian friends. But so when we look ahead, we should expect something else to happen. We should expect in the coming days to see a few different things. For one, we can expect within Russia they will try to crack down more. They'll try to monitor more where the elites are going. And it's not just because they care about their loyalty. It's also because they don't want to see more money leave the country. Already, the government's limiting how much money you can take from the ATM. But now, they're also limiting how much you could take from the teller's window in banks. In fact, it's less than $300 a day. So just imagine you had several $1,000s there. What would you do if you could no longer get the money out? If all of a sudden you had to do over the course of a couple of weeks? Now imagine an entire country, though, when there's a run on the bank and there's no longer the ability to get your cash. And that creates havoc. And in fact, that destabilizes regimes. So for Vladimir Putin, when you look at something small like an attack within Iran, you would think that's far away. That doesn't directly affect him. But in fact, it very much so directly affects him. Every aspect of what we see going on right now in Iran, what we see going on right now in Mexico, with the killing of the leader of one of the largest narco groups in the country, all of these things directly fit together. And all of these things are beneficial to Ukraine. That's why today we're yet one day closer to victory. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.